Hi, everybody. I hope you all had a wonderful week. Today, we are going to paint a red bird, and I just find this subject really relaxing, and it's kind of what I need because things are amping up, and I'm not ready for it. So this is going to be my way to unwind. So I'm using all of these materials in today's lesson. It's pretty typical for me. The only unusual one is salt. However, you can use traditional table salt. It doesn't matter what type, but it's going to help with some texture. There's a full list of all these materials in the video description. If you would like to review it, go for that. Otherwise, let's get started. These are the paint colors I will be using today. You don't need these exact colors. Just get somewhere close. If you want a full list of these colors, it is down in the video description. Lamp black, cadmium red, hooker's green, burnt umber, ultramarine, and cadmium yellow. Go ahead and pause the video while you gather your colors. Also in the video description is a line drawing as well as a reference photo that you can download for free. I want you to print the line drawing at the dimensions you plan on doing your painting. Once you have, if you do not have graphite paper or transfer paper, which looks like this, you can do a transfer just using a standard pencil from home. The way you do that is you take your line drawing and flip it over. On the back side of your line drawing, take a pencil and apply graphite all over the entire line drawing. Once you've done that, you're then going to take the line drawing, put it on top of your watercolor paper so the graphite is touching. And you're then going to take a piece of tape it in position so it doesn't shift, and then begin using a ballpoint pen to trace your subject. With just the pressure of your pen, your lines will transfer onto the watercolor paper. You want a medium gray, so don't press so hard that you get black lines. Otherwise, you won't be able to remove your lines and they'll always show up in your finished painting. If you do have graphite transfer paper, it is just a little bit faster. However, the downside is if you press too hard using this transfer paper, no eraser will lift up the color. So you just have to be cautious of your pressure. So I'm going to begin tracing. And to make sure I'm not pushing too hard, I'm going to lift up my page. Here it looks a little too dark, so I need to go a little lighter with my pressure. And I will just continue tracing this entire subject. If you do not want to watch me trace, you can skip ahead in the video to watch the beginning of the painting by using the hyperlinked chapters that are also in the video description. I always find that I get a more steady, consistent line if I am pulling my line towards my torso. That's my personal preference. I find that if you push your pen away from your body, you tend to become more unstable and your lines will shake. You don't have to trace every single line. Just trace the ones that you feel like will help you. Before I remove my line drawing, I'm just going to peek, make sure I have transferred all the lines that I want to include. Paying particular attention to the feet and the head. Once I'm happy with it, I can set the transfer paper aside and remove the line drawing. Now, most of the subject for today's painting involves a lot of dark colors. However, there are a couple areas that I want to be aware of. Since our paints are translucent, any dark lines around the beak where I have some softer pinks and oranges, they're going to show. So I need to lighten up those lines. Same with the ends of any feathers that are a little lighter in color that are the bright reds and that don't go into shadows. So for that reason, I'm going to use a kneaded eraser. It's a really fun tool. And I'm just going to erase any of the smudges that are a result of me resting my hand on my paper while tracing. And I'm going to just tap on top of the lines that I want to be lighter in color. So any lines that I hope do not show up in the finished product, I just want to lighten them up. A lot of the feathers down here are going to have some blacks in the shadows, so I'm fairly confident I can hide most of those. But the feathers on the head I'm concerned about. I want to make sure those are nice and light. Same with on the beak. I don't want those to be too dark. The underside of my bird, as far as the belly, it's mostly in shadow, so I don't foresee any of those lines really showing up too much. But again, it's always better to be safe than sorry. And I definitely don't want super dark lines around the feet because that's not exactly where I want my focal point to be. The wood, the tail, I'm not so worried about. Okay, now that the value of my pencil lines are where I want them, I am going to begin mixing color. So I've decided to paint the bird without a background, just to kind of keep today's lesson a little shorter. So I'm going to get some water over to my palette. And my goal is to mix up the colors that I plan on using in both the bird as well as the wood. So I'm just using my brush to kind of carry a small amount of water over to multiple wells on my palette. Just a small amount because I want the colors to be vibrant. And I'm going to begin mixing. So I want a few different shades of red. And if I want a few different shades of red, I'm going to make a point to put red in a few areas of my well. So this is just cadmium red that I've put in all three areas, and it feels a little on the red-orange side to me. So to darken it up a bit, I'm going to add alizarin crimson. That way we get to more of like a Coca-Cola red. Anytime the paint starts to feel thick or goopy, you need more water. It should be watery. So that looks like a really nice vibrant red. However, the way our color appears on our palette can be incredibly deceiving. So I always like to have scrap pieces of watercolor paper laying around so that when I feel like the color might be right, I thoroughly dunk my brush in the paint color and I drag it across the rim and I just test out on a scrap piece of paper what my color looks like. And we want to keep in mind that that color will lighten up when it dries. So if you want it darker than that, you need to add more pigment. I feel pretty good about that paint color. So I'm now going to test out the color that is cadmium red by itself. I always wipe my brush off on the rim of the palette first before I test it out. I like that color as well. It's a little lighter. And I'm now going to rinse the red out of my brush, and I'm going to add a little bit of the cadmium yellow to the remaining red. Anytime I go to dip back in my yellow, I re-rinse my brush. I don't want to contaminate my yellow. This is definitely a nice orange. I don't know that I'll be using that in a whole lot of areas, but I do want to have that option. Okay, now that I have my reds mixed up, I'm going to mix up the colors I want to use in the wood. So for that, I'm going to use some burnt umber. So I'm just taking my wet brush into the pigment cup. And this is just paint that I've squeezed from the watercolor tube, and it just dries in between me sitting down to paint. Once I feel like the color might be right, I'm going to test it out. If I'm happy with it, I'll move on. I'm also going to mix up some Payne's Gray. But I want to add some warmth to this Payne's Gray. So I'm going to add just a little bit of the burnt umber brown. And I'm going to add a little bit of cadmium red. I know that seems strange, but all right. And I don't want this color to be too dark, but I like that color there. I think that works. And then lastly, I'm going to do a brown with some added red, and I want it to be on the lighter side. So I'm using burnt umber, and I'm then going to grab my cadmium red. And I feel like that's still a little too dark, so I'm going to lighten it up a little bit. Sure doesn't look like I lightened it up. So I'm just adding water to make it lighter. And that feels a little better. All right, so this palette right now is very warm. I do want more of a dark burgundy red to use in the shadows. So to make that burgundy, I'm going to use cadmium red, so about 75% cadmium red. And I want the color to be very, very rich and dark, so I'm getting in there and I'm getting quite a bit of paint. And I used very little water. Once I feel like I have a nice vibrant red, now I'm going to rinse my brush and add some burnt umber, or not burnt umber, ultramarine blue. And I only need about 25% of this ultramarine blue. And I feel like that's a pretty good color. If I need to go darker than that, I can always add more pigment later. Okay. So for right now, we are just going to get a base color all over our subject. I am going to stay out of the beak area. However, everything else on the bird, I'm going to wet. I will also stay out of the feet. So I'm being pretty heavy-handed with the amount of water I'm applying at the moment, because I know that initial application of water gets absorbed into the paper really fast. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. All right, so I'm going to tip my paper so you can see how glossy it is. It is very, very glossy. No areas of the paper are beginning to dry. And I'm making a point to watch the low points in my paper because I don't want puddles. If I see puddles in the low point, I just pull from them and I extend the water over some of the high points just to make sure the water is even. Now, I want to determine light source, and I want it to be coming from the top. So I want there to really be some great contrast and brightness to this bird. So to achieve that, I'm going to start with the orange, believe it or not. However, I am going to apply this color away from the edge. Kind of through the center there. All right. Also, to help with the brightness is I'm going to add a little bit of light, so watered down ultramarine blue, to the upper portion of the back. So when any blacks are hit by the sun or light, a lot of times there's these really faint blues that you will see with them. So to kind of get the light that I want, I put just a little bit of soft blues there, as well as at the end of my wing. Now this tail is already beginning to dry, so before I worry about tiny details, I am going to resaturate this tail with some clean water just to make sure it remains wet until I'm ready to paint it. Okay, so I'm now going to dry my clean brush off on my sponge by just dragging it across the sponge. And then I come back to my painting with my dry brush at the low points of the paper where I have puddles of paint. And I'm soaking up those puddles because I don't want them. It makes it hard for me to control where the paint's going. Now that I've soaked up the excess puddles, I'm going to clean my brush, tap my sponge so it's damp, and I can now use my brush to blend some of the colors right on the wet surface. So my goal here is to pull from those oranges so I can create some lighter, feather texture at the top of the head. So I'm just kind of pulling some of that color around to get some softer values. Now I'm going to get that Coca-Cola red. I'm going to dip my brush real good in it, but I'm going to drag my brush across the rim of the palette so it's only semi-loaded. Now I'm going to come in to my bird, and I'm tapping my brush, making little dots in areas where I want more rich color. And right now it looks kind of funky, I know. However, trust in the process and you'll see how this all comes together. So we just need to move fast enough that our colors and paint don't begin to dry on us too soon. As I get towards the bottom underbelly of my bird, as well as the table, I am going to grab some of that burgundy color that I had made up with the red and ultramarine blue. And I'm going to come right into the belly here and get some good color saturation. Also, right on that tail, there's a lot of shadow. So I'm going to get some burgundy right in there. That Coca-Cola red, I need just a little bit more on the underside of the bird. And again, this isn't our finished layer. This is just our first layer. So we have to try to avoid overthinking it. And now I am going to get a little bit more of that orange on my brush because I want some brightness to the feathers on the wing here. Now I'm going to rinse my brush and set my number 10 round aside, and I'm going to pick up my small number 2 round. I'm grabbing some of that orange again, and I just want to get some of that orange on the top sections of some of these little wing feathers, as well as on the tail, because I want to give the illusion of the sun hitting my bird from the top. Now I have still a good sheen to my bird, so that means I've got some working time to continue to play. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to be kind of fussy about some of the shapes. So I'm going to grab some of the cadmium red, and I'm just going to kind of go through some of the head feathers, and maybe with my small brush, I'm just kind of creating some texture. Now, something I've learned with painting cardinals is it's really easy to fuss with the feathers on their head so much that it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So try to be okay with the feathers not being perfect and try to avoid that temptation of really continuing to play with them excessively and making them larger and larger unintentionally. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go along the belly of the bird while it's wet, and I want to make the belly look fuzzy. So I'm kind of pulling some of the paint out so it looks like feathers. I don't want it to look plastic or ceramic. I want there to be some texture to the edge of my bird. I can continue to use this cadmium red and my small brush. Since I have just a little bit of shine still left, I can kind of go through the back of the wing here, and I'm making very small marks, just tapping my brush, creating little dots. I'm going to do the same thing by grabbing some of that really rich Coca-Cola red that we mixed up. And I'm just going on the underside of these feathers to kind of create a shadow. And any kind of brush strokes I'm making, I'm trying to kind of follow the direction that the feathers would go in. Now I'm going to continue using the cadmium red just to kind of fill in some of these central feathers, because I still have this beautiful dampness to my paper. So I'm able to kind of get some really soft effects, but still have some control, which is really a fun place to be in. If your paper is already dry, you can just, be hands off for now and come back to it to add these layers afterwards, just doing wet on dry. And my paper's really starting to dry, so I have to kind of step away very soon. So with that in mind, I'm just going to add a couple small details using the Burgundy color, establishing some of the shadows that I want around the head. I also want to get some of the burgundies in on the wings. And my goal is not to define every single wing. I just want to imply wings. I always want to make sure I have good shadows on the underside of the side wing. And I think this is about all I can do because I'm losing that glossy sheen on a lot of my bird. However, you can see that we've established a lot of wonderful color in the first pass. And after this completely dries, then we can go in, paint wet on dry, and start getting more detailed. However, I can just jump right to the wood, to do the next layer. Sorry, I'm having a hard time talking today. So I'm going to use my large flat brush just to help wet this area faster. And although my line drawing stopped here, short of the edge of my paper, I'm extending my water all the way down to enlarge my painting. So it kind of looks more complete. So the first initial layer of water, I want to be heavy. If your bird was drying really fast, that means we didn't apply enough water in the beginning. So just learn from that experience. Don't let it frustrate you, and go into this little wood post and just be heavier handed with your water. And sometimes I find it helpful to let water sit in puddles on your paper, let that soak in, and then do a second layer of water. That will help you get additional working time. So while those puddles are sitting, I'm going to take my time with a number 6 round, pushing that water right up to the edges. And I'm trying to be careful about going around the feet. If you've ever painted a bird with me, you'll know that painting their feet isn't my funnest part, or isn't my favorite, I should say. But I'm all for the challenge, and I hope you guys are too. So I'm continuing to just kind of make sure that my water goes right up to my edges. There are some areas where my water did, in fact, absorb into the paper, so I had to do a second layer. Okay. So now that everything is saturated, I want to make sure that there's no standing puddles. If there are, it's just going to make it difficult for me to control where my paint goes. So to control the puddles, I dry my brush off on my sponge and I use my dry brush to just tap the top surface of the puddles. I'm not doing this to dry the paper. I'm doing it to even out the water. I'm still leaving it plenty wet. So if you look at my paper, it's very, very glossy still. Now I'm going to go ahead and get some of that burnt umber. And I'm going to get some color on the wood here. Now, with the light source coming from above, the top of this stump or, wood post is going to be brighter. So I'm not going to be bringing too much color up there. I might even just bring some of that soft blue up there again. So I think I am going to do that. I'm going to rinse my brush, tap my sponge so I don't dilute my colors further. And I'm going to grab some of that really watered down ultramarine blue. And I'm going to put that along this top edge of the post. If you have puddles of paint making it difficult to control where your paint colors go, dry your brush off on a sponge or paper towel and just pick it up. As I get closer to the feet, it's difficult for me to see where my brush is going. So I'm switching to my small number 2 round so I can more confidently get into some of these tight, narrow areas without fear of hitting the feet and accidentally filling them in. If I do fill them in with some color, it's not going to be a big deal because the feet are actually pretty dark themselves. No one will know except for us. All right. So now I'm going to grab some of that kind of red-browned mixture that I made up. And I'm just going to tap this in kind of randomly on the wood here. Keeping my colors down low so as not to kind of mess with the top. If I have puddling of paint, I dry my brush by dragging it on a sponge or paper towel, and I just take my dry brush over to the puddles of paint, tap the top surface to pick them up. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab some of that gray and brown mixture, the Payne's Gray. And I'm just getting a few darker details in here. Trying to be a little asymmetrical with it. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Trying to get some darks towards the top so it kind of reads like the lip of the wood. In the areas that are still white, I can just kind of use a clean brush to pull some paint color from the surrounding areas, but I'm okay with those being lighter in value. So now, if you've ever seen me enjoy doing some wood texture, I'm going to take some salt. You got to drop it while things are glossy, otherwise it's not going to work. And I'm just going to drop some of this salt onto the wood. I don't want to be too heavy-handed with dropping it, otherwise the whole wood will just turn white. So I have to be kind of selective. I'm not doing the whole thing. I definitely want some texture along the top ridge. That's why I'm being a little heavier up there. But otherwise, the rest of it I'm keeping pretty light. Now I have to let those salt crystals sit on the wet surface, and what's going to happen is they're going to absorb the paint that they are currently sitting on, and as a result, it's going to leave a white space underneath the salt crystal with a little bit of kind of this starburst effect, and it's just going to add to the rough texture of our wood. So I need to give this some time to dry because my bird is still cold to the touch, so it's not ready for its next layer, and the salt needs time to react. So I'm going to step away and come back when things are completely dry. Now that everything is completely dry, I can get a stiff piece of paper and I can scrape the salt away. I can just make a pile on my table so I can just easily scoop that into a trash can. Okay, so now we're ready to start working on some details. Now, this is where we want to kind of gradually build values. My personal goal is always to have some of the brightest colors along with some of the darkest colors and every value in between. So with that being said, I'm going to start with, I think, my number 6 round. And I'm going to start glazing some details on top of my current bird. So I'm going to get some of the cadmium red, but I want to add some water to it so it's more the consistency of tea because I want to do some glazing. So as you can see here, it's pretty light. I didn't go very dark. And once I have the right consistency, now I can go in to the feathers on my bird's head and just add some texture details that are subtle but still make a difference. If I have any puddling of paint, I can just dry my brush and soak up the puddle of paint. But my goal is not to cover up the light layers. My goal is to just add some detail. So I'm going to let that dry. If I keep playing in the area, then everything just starts becoming one shape. So I'm now going to get some of my cadmium red. I'm going to pull it aside on my palette and add some water so it's a lighter value. And I'm just going to come here towards the back of the eye. And I just want to get some feather texture here on the back. Now, anytime I'm doing feathers, I need to watch for the length of the feather because that's going to vary based on where it's at on the body, as well as the direction that the feathers are going in. Now, your brain is going to tell you to make the feathers all perfect, the same length and the same direction with the same spacing. If you do this, it won't look natural. I want you to consider starting your lines at different points, having some longer, some are shorter, and this will give you a more natural look. But it takes practice and it takes a very light touch while holding your brush more vertical. And you also don't want to overload your brush with too much paint. Otherwise, it just ends up becoming really wide texture and marks. So keep your brush nice and light. Don't overload your brush. So I'm continuing to use that same kind of soft cadmium red color just to add some feather texture on the head, around the neck. Notice that I'm allowing that negative space to be in between my strokes. And I'm not going so heavy that I lose the color and values that I achieved on the first layer. Again, my goal is not to cover up all that I've achieved so far. My goal is to just add texture and details. Now I'm going to get my Coca-Cola red. I'm going to water it down a little bit, not too much, because it needs to be visible when I go over the side belly here. Now, as we get to the belly and chest, the feathers are slightly longer, so I need to be aware of that. And I need the feathers to kind of follow the contour of the belly. So just subtle little curves. I'm also going to use this Coca-Cola red with very small little dashed lines to create some texture on the shoulder of the bird. Notice how I'm not going on autopilot and just doing lines anywhere. I'm not just filling it in with dense texture. I'm leaving some areas of break between my texture. So this will give the eyes a place to rest and be more visually appealing. I'm now going to get some of that burgundy red, but I want to water it down as well. And I need to do a glaze just to darken up some of these feathers. So I've watered it down quite a bit, so it's not super dark. And I need to come in and give a little bit more contrast and shadow to some of these feathers. I'm going to continue using that burgundy as it's watered down. I'm just going to create some areas that are more in shadow. I'm adding some of that burgundy just in some of the shadows of the head. Still trying to be very selective and sparing. Add a little bit on the forehead and above the eye. Just a little bit towards the back feathers. Maybe there's some that are kind of peeking through from the opposite side, so they're in shadow. But notice how light my texture is. I'm trying to get that thin, wispy texture, and it just takes practice, but I feel like it helps a lot when it comes to painting birds. All right. So I'm going to get some additional dark burgundy. And I'm going to go to the underbelly of the bird and try and push these shadows to be darker. I'm making my cardinal look very fuzzy, which is kind of fun. So I've got some nice texture now on the belly. Now I'm going to use that same dark burgundy, but I'm going to add a little bit of that Payne's gray to it, so it's darker still. And I need to create a really nice shadow on the underside of the wing. So I'm going to come in, and here's the trick. I need to paint just a single shadow with one stroke, rinse my brush quickly, dab my sponge so it's just damp, and then I need to soften the edge before the paint stroke dries. This is something that takes practice. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to find the edge of the wing. I want my shadow to be underneath it. I'm now going to rinse my brush. I'm going to tap my sponge, but not dry my brush. And I'm now going to go to the bottom edge of this paint stroke to soften it so it looks like it belongs. So I'm basically kind of blending it in with the rest of the bird. And you can see here that I accidentally went outside my line or my edge of my bird. I'm not going to panic about that. That's now a feather. So I'm just not even going to worry about it. So I just re-rinsed my brush, and I'm just using some of that water with light pressure just to kind of soften that shadow so it kind of blends in with the surrounding area. Now, I can't add any details to the bottom area where it's wet now, so I need to give that some space. However, I am now going to take some of that cadmium red. I want to water it down. And I do want to get more color in this wing here. I feel like it's a little light. I'm okay with it being light, maybe towards the top, but on the side here, I think I like the idea of giving a little bit more rich color. Now I cannot come in contact with that shadow. The shadow is still drying. If I come in contact with that shadow right now, it's going to pull that shadow color into these oranges, and it's just going to mess up the whole thing. So I'm going to stay away from those. I like these soft blues here. I think it's pretty, so I'm going to try and maintain those blues. And I'm just going to give that wing some time to dry. So while those areas in my bird are drying, I can then begin work on the wood. For the wood, we are going to use a dry brush technique. If you followed my last watercolor tutorial, I covered this, so this will be a refresher for some of you. I'm going to have a scrap piece of paper similar in quality to the one I'm working on, preferably something with texture. The watercolor paper we're working on is also textured. What I'm going to do is I'm going to really dip my brush in well to that Payne's gray brown mixture. And after thoroughly dipping my brush, I'm then going to drag it across the surface of my sponge so that I'm kind of removing some of that paint. Now I'm going to hold my brush parallel to the table, and I am not painting with the end of my brush. I am going to be dragging the side profile across the top surface of the texture. And because I pulled out some of the paint, my brush won't leave as much of a heavy texture, or the marks won't be as wide and consistent. But you can see the wonderful texture that this dry brush technique will create. So on a scrap piece of paper, practice for yourself, but once you're comfortable with it, We're then going to just hold our brush parallel, use that side profile to create texture. And we're just trying to kind of get some fun, rough texture in on this wood. I'm very careful towards the edges. I am going to need more paint. And I'm not going all the way up to the very top when I do this. I am deliberately giving some space because I want the top of the wood post to remain bright. I don't want to darken it up too much. So I'm holding that brush on the side. If the brush is not dry enough, it's going to want to leave, larger marks. So sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But as long as it's a rough texture, that's what we want. I have to really move slow when I get closer to the outer edges. So with that texture being overlapped, it looks really, really fun. And now I'm going to switch to my smaller number 6 round, and in a more controlled way, I'm going to try and just add some details. So, for example, maybe some cracks in the wood, or just kind of darkening up maybe some of the top texture. So typically along the rim, there should be quite a bit of texture and some darker colors. So I'm going to go in here and I'm just kind of tapping my brush and dragging it, creating little dots. It's uneven. I'm not being consistent with it or perfect about it. I just want some rough texture. And I'm trying to kind of create some fun, interesting shapes. And maybe the edge of the wood kind of recedes back away from the light source. So maybe there's some shadows in here because there's some gaps or breaks in the wood. So I can kind of go along that right edge and add some texture. Maybe there's a crack in the wood that kind of goes down part way and then stops. And then maybe it kind of picks back up towards the bottom. Maybe along the top ridge, we have a chip of wood that's kind of come out. So maybe it leaves a darker shape or gap. Maybe that broken wood has kind of left a darker area down the wood. I can draw another little crack right below the foot of the cardinal. As the crack comes down, it starts to thin out. I'm not trying to make everything, perfect lines. I'm trying to embrace texture and just kind of have fun. If my hand shakes or wobbles, it actually helps in the texture of the wood. So I'm just continuing to add some texture, trying to push the darks. I'm going to grab some of that warm brown that we added a little bit of the red to. I'm just going to add some texture using this warm brown. Maybe there's some of that texture up at the top ridge. And sometimes I just use some of the shadows and shapes that were created from the dry brush to inspire, maybe that's the lighter area. And then maybe the darker area that the dry brush created, maybe that's where there's some damage in the wood or some breaks. So just kind of roll with it. Try not to overwork it and have fun. And I think I like where the wood is at for now, so I don't feel like it's really necessary to add anything else. So I'm going to do my best to put my brush down as far as the wood's concerned, and now I can return back to the Cardinal. Now the Cardinal's wing feathers, I want to keep the central area lighter, but as the color extends towards the end of that wing, it gets a little darker, more into reds. So I'm going to get that cadmium red that's by itself, and I'm going to water it down a bit. So I'm going to create kind of a tea consistency. And I don't want my brush overloaded, so I'm tapping my sponge to get rid of any excess paint. And I just want to create a glaze here at the end of the feathers, just to kind of give a hint of some darker color here. Notice how my lines varied in length. I can also use this glaze to maybe push some of the reds on the head if I feel like I want it to be just a smidge darker. But again, I want to have a variety of values, so I'm really trying to hold back on the temptation of overworking it. I'm going to rinse the red out of my brush, and I'm now going to mix up a darker Payne's Gray. Now, if you're not well practiced with a paintbrush, making thin, long lines that are consistent in width may not be easy. It's going to take some, trial and error. So use a scrap piece of paper to just kind of practice first. And then when you're ready, we're going to come into the tail here and we're going to add some shadows to divide some of these feathers. You don't want your brush to be too overloaded with paint, otherwise it makes really wide lines. And right now, I didn't like my line, so I kept going over it again and again. And just like I tell my students often, try to avoid it. Don't keep going back in and making the line larger. Here I am doing it. So I'm human. I just, kept trying to make it better. But I'm going to show you how to handle this situation, where maybe it didn't quite go as you intended, and maybe now you need some help. Okay. So I'm going to let that dry, and I'm going to show you how to thin out some lines that maybe didn't quite go as planned. Meanwhile, I'm going to thin out this Payne's Gray a little bit so it's not quite as dark, so it's more of a gray. And with this color, I'm going to do a glaze in a few areas. So down below some of the wings, I just want to kind of push the darks. I do want to include some hints of black and gray on the back wing. So I'm just choosing to kind of come in here and add a few select details. Maybe some of the texture on the wing can be a little darker and have some blacks in it. So just creating some shadows. Trying to keep my line work, wispy and light. So I'm holding my brush pretty vertical and keeping my pressure very light. All right. I'm now going to move on to the beak of the bird. I'm going to continue with my number 6 round, but I'm going to apply a little bit of water into the beak first. Doesn't need to be real heavy. It's okay if the water extends into the red of the feathers, because there will be some black eventually in this area. Now the beak is another one where, in my experience, the more you fiddle with it, the longer and longer the beak becomes, and next thing you know, your cardinal's looking like a hummingbird. It's kind of entertaining when it happens, but also disappointing at the same time. So just be cautious, move slow with your adjustments so that doesn't happen. I'm using a dry brush just to soak up some of the excess paint that I created while painting the beak. And notice I did not bring the paint all the way to the top of the beak. I left that open. That way I can bring just a clean, practically dry brush up to the top portion of the beak, and I can just make that top portion just a real subtle orange, something that is a different value than the bottom, but dark enough to be seen against the white background. And I just want the bottom half of the beak to be a little darker. So I'm going to give that beak some time to dry. And let's go back to this tail. Let's address how you handle when your line work doesn't go as planned. So this is a clean, stiff, square brush. Okay, it's actually an acrylic brush. This one is made by Royal. It's a soft grip or soft grip 1/2 inch. But I like it for lifting. So I'm going to get it wet with clean water. I'm going to use a small cup just so you can see, but I don't want to risk getting color on my painting. So dip your brush into the water. I want you to use your fingers to squeegee the excess water out of that brush. Okay. Now I want you to move your brush parallel against your paper surface over top of areas of the lines that you would like to lift and thin out. Notice the bristles in my brush are barely bending. I'm going to zoom in so you can see this. All right, let's see if we can get the camera to focus. All right. So notice as I'm doing this, how little the bristles of my brush bend. Not much at all. That shows you how gentle I am with my pressure. Okay. So what that means is, depending on the brand of paints you're working with, some paints are staining and some paints are non-staining. I know these paints pretty well. I've worked with them for years teaching, and I find that they can be pretty forgiving. Once you get to the more professional grade paints, they're wonderful, very highly pigmented, but some of them are staining, and once they go on the paper, they're not going to want to lift up as easily to correct mistakes. So this is kind of a nice medium place to start. But I just went in and I lifted out to thin the black line. So anywhere where I felt like the line was a little too wide, I come in with a square brush that is damp and very gentle pressure, and I just lift that out. Now, granted, the lines that are there now are kind of white. I'm not really bothered by it, but I will probably be going back and at least applying a glaze of red to tint it. That way it looks like it belongs in that area. But same with, up here, maybe my tail got a little too wide there. As long as my colors are non-staining, I can actually try and move this so you can see it. I can actually come in here with gentle pressure and a stiff brush and just lift that dry paint. Once I see that paint starting to lift up, I take a dry paper towel and dab firmly on the paper to remove the paint that I just lifted. It's just a really nice thing to know that you can do with watercolors to clean up little variations or things that you didn't quite go as planned. So it's starting to look better, but now I want to tint those areas that are looking a little white with more of a red. That way it looks like it kind of belongs in that zone. So the original red we used there was that burgundy. So I want to use that same red so it kind of looks like it's still in shadow. And I'm just going to come across those areas of white where I lifted. And I just want to glaze this red right on top. And now I'm much happier with the width of that. I can also come in here with the burgundy in the areas where I have some shadows, and I can just kind of do a little smushing, very technical term. Push those colors around just to kind of get some texture and make it blend better. So now let's address the wing of the bird. So this is another opportunity for us to potentially accidentally go too wide with our lines. So we just need to go in with a small brush and light pressure. I'm going to use my number 2 round, very small. I'm going to get the black on my brush, but I make sure to tap my sponge so that it's not overloaded with paint. That way I don't get large, wide lines. And then I'm rotating my painting to make sure that it's at an angle that feels comfortable for me to kind of follow the wing. Because some angles I find difficult to drag my hand. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. So the wings of every bird are a little different. It doesn't have to be perfect. So try to take it easy on yourself. And remember, if the lines kind of got too close together and it looks like one thick black line, let it dry. Do the lifting technique we did on the tail. And just be patient with yourself. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to push some of the shadows to be a little darker. Notice how my lines are not all the same length. I'm trying to avoid creating a pattern. So I feel like the wings are starting to get there. I think I still need some line work to be a little thicker. I ended up just putting a whole lot of lines on, you guys. I don't know if that's the right move or not, but I'm having fun. I'm relaxing. I'm doing this painting for me. All right. I feel like some of my lines were a little wide at the end of the feathers where they should taper. So I'm going to take my brush. The lines are dry. And I'm going to do that lifting technique. All right. So I have a clean paper towel handy. I'm going to rotate my painting in a way that I can easily kind of reach. And I just want to thin out the lines towards the back end of the wing. And then if I have to come in with some tints of red, I can. But notice how the paint I'm lifting is now on my brush. So my brush is dirty. So I now need to re-rinse. So the bristles of my brush are barely bending. I'm keeping my pressure very light. So I'm just kind of going through and getting the feather detail in the side wing where I want it. It takes time, and everybody's painting is going to require a different approach. But through all of this, we're learning. All right, so now I have to admit, with that lifted color, it kind of revealed some of my original layers and tints, and I like it. It's kind of a happy accident. So I don't want to mess too much more with that. So I feel like that side wing is where I want it. I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to return to my small number 2 round so I can work on the head and darken up some of those feathers. I'm going to first paint the eye of our bird blue. I know that sounds weird, but just trust in the process. So I'm just filling in the entire eye with a blue, just trying to get a nice shape, a nice circle. And remember, if you keep fiddling in pursuit of perfection, your eye is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So just be careful of that. So I'm getting some Payne's Gray on my brush. This is dark. And I'm going to go down the back edge of where the beak is. So I can kind of give a hint of some black feathers on the opposite side of the bird. I'm just kind of marking where I want the edge of my beak to be. And now I can come in and create some fun little feather textures that go on top of the beak. And I can start adding some fun feather textures on the back of the beak as well. I think I need more sleep or coffee, you guys. I feel like I'm not making a whole lot of sense today. Hopefully you're getting the gist. Trying to get some of those rich black feathers. If I overload my brush, my lines are going to be really wide and not as wispy. As long as the eye is completely dry, you can bring this black right up to the edge of the eye. So I'm trying not to make it fuzzy. I'm trying to just follow that contour of the eye because the black feathers should just meet up naturally with the top of the eye as well as along the bottom. Some of those black feathers might be popping out on the back edge just behind the eye. But now in the very center, this is going to be the tricky part. I want you guys to use that black and small brush. Make sure it's not overloaded so you're able to control where your paint goes. And I want you to try and create a circle within the circle without touching the outside edges. So we want there to be some thin section of blue just on the outside because there's little scales that go around a bird's eye. And then we're going to leave a little bit of that blue inside the eye to act as a reflection. And look at that, we have an eye. Now I'm going to use the kind of warm brown that we have for the legs. I don't want my legs to be too wide because I don't want them to really be a focal point. Painting the scales on bird legs takes practice. And since I don't want it to be a focal point, I'm going to thin out my legs a little bit. All right, so let's bring our attention to the feet. And I'm just going to go across the top edge, staying below my pencil line. And I'm going to kind of create both sides of the leg. the scales kind of move across the leg in a curved direction, and then they kind of stop, and the rest of the leg is a little more smooth. I'm going to do this on both front and back leg, trying to match the thickness of the legs. Be okay with them being imperfect, because if you keep fiddling with them, they will get bigger and bigger, guaranteed. I'm now going to switch to a darker brown that includes some black in it, because I need these feet details to kind of stand out from the wood. So I'm going to create little circles that kind of follow the contour of the toe to create those little scales. And I know in these beginning stages, these feet are going to look really funky. And if you want to approach them in a different way, you can. I just don't want to be here forever painting little bird scales. I'm going to do the same thing on the front foot. I'm having a hard time telling which toe from the other. Now I'm going to use a darker Payne's gray. I don't want it to be solid black, because the last thing I need is to bring attention to the talons on this bird. Because painting little claws, I have discovered, is not easy. So take your time, go a little lighter. That way it doesn't become a focal point in case the results didn't really come out the way you want. But I'm going through here and just trying to put subtle, curved little talons on the feet. They should have 3 toes on front and 1 on back. Some might be out of sight. That talon got a little large. That's okay. All right, so I'm going to go to the maroon color that I mixed up, but I'm going to water it down significantly so it's more of a real soft pink. So this is the color I'm working with. That's still even too dark. So I want just a really nice soft pink, okay? And what I want to do is I want to come in to this leg and just create some color to these toes. And notice how some areas I'm allowing there to be whites. I'll come back and kind of tint them eventually. But right now I want to at least have one area of the leg where the light is hitting it. rather than just filling it all in. Now this back foot is more in shadow, so I can use a darker version of this color and go more bold. So in the back foot, I want more shadow. So I'm going to use a watered down version of the not the burnt umber, the ultramarine blue. So I can push some of the colors to be a little darker. So adding blue to elements that you want to push more towards the background is going to really help you. And I'm tempted to keep fiddling with this leg. However, I don't want it to keep getting bigger and bigger. So I need to kind of give it some space so it can dry. I'm going to add just a little bit of these ultramarine blues. All right, I need to give those feet some space. I feel like I am rushing it. So let's just take a look at the rest of our bird for now. And one of the areas that I always want to push to be darker is the eye. I want that eye to be a really rich black. It's kind of a focal point. So I'm going to get some more Payne's gray on my brush. And I'm not going to be afraid to do a second layer of black on my existing pupil. I can also take this black and I can add additional darks and texture to the black feathers that are around the beak. That way it doesn't look like it's lacking in detail. I'm going to dip in the orange, but I want to water it down a bit. So it's just a light glaze. And I just want to add a little bit more of a definition to where the separation is between the top and bottom beak. I can add some orange to create some shadows up near All right, I've given my feet enough space. I've learned over the years that shadows can really help ground an element. And right now, I feel like the bird's feet are kind of not grounded. It just doesn't look right. So I'm going to go in with a medium value of Payne's gray with a small brush. I'm going to try and create a shadow below this foot. Hopefully that'll help it look better. And I do feel like that's helping. I'm going to use some of that maroon and ultramarine blue to kind of make a deep purple color. So I can give some details to this back foot that I think got washed out. So it's really easy to just want to quit when you get to the feet. Wouldn't it be nice if just we could make all birds just sit, cover up their feet? They always have to be holding on to something. So I'm trying to just be patient. I'd hate to rush this, final detail. And one of the things that is bugging me is I feel like the middle toe of this back foot needs to be longer. So unfortunately, to correct that, I'm going to come in and have to lift some color out of that toe. Yeah, I feel like just these toes in general ended up being too short. So I'm just pushing the darks on the shadow. Trying to embrace some of that scale texture. And they're starting to look better. I'm starting to get more happy with it. I can't fix the toes on this foot until the area where I erased dries. So I'm just trying to work in other areas so I can be patient. Maybe I'll use some of these purples on the underbelly to kind of push the shadow. And the scales around the eye are basically like tiny circles that are all just in line. But since I painted this pretty small, I'm just doing little dots to kind of break up that circle so it looks like some scales. And now I feel like things have dried enough for me to kind of correct the feet here. So I feel like the Talon needs to be quite a bit lower. So I'm going to paint that small claw going over the edge. And then I can add some of those scales, and then I'm going to paint another claw going over the edge. What did I tell you, you guys? Feet are hard. They'd be much easier if I painted larger, but all right, I'm just going to give a tint to the areas of the feet that I lifted. And I feel like that completes our bird. I'm pretty happy with it. I don't want to mess anymore with the wing because I'm pleased with how it turned out. But I hope you learned a lot from this tutorial. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, or leave a comment. I would also love to see any finished paintings. Have a fantastic week.